September 1945, Tokyo Prefecture. The air was silent. For years, Japanese civilians had learned to fear the sound of engines overhead. B-29 bombers meant fire, destruction, and death. Mothers would clutch their children, waiting for the next blast. Cities had turned to ash. Hunger had taken over where bombs left off. But this time, something was different. On a quiet morning, survivors stepped outside as distant aircraft approached. The familiar shadows crossed the sky, wide metal wings glinting against sunlight. Panic rippled through the streets. People braced for the worst. Yet instead of explosions, something else began to fall. Objects tumbled downward, fluttering with attached parachutes. No flames, no smoke, just packages. Food, rice, canned goods, flour, powdered milk. Life itself raining from the same skies that once burned their homes. Children stared upward in disbelief. An elderly man dropped to his knees, tears tracing the dust on his face. The war was over, but no one expected mercy to arrive from above. This moment, confusion turning into hope, was only the beginning of a transformation that would reshape an entire nation. In the final year of World War II, Japan was a starving empire. By early 1945, the nation's food supply was in freefall. American submarines had choked shipping lanes, cutting off imports of rice and grains from Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. Farm fields at home produced only a fraction of what was needed. Many young farmers had been drafted into the war. Bombing raids destroyed storage silos, railways, and the ability to deliver what little remained. Japanese civilians survived on rationing that shrank each month. From 2,000 calories a day in 1941 to 1,400 to barely 1,000 in the summer of 1945. For many, even these numbers were only on paper. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and nearly every major city lay in ruins. Wooden neighborhoods had burned into black skeletons. Families lived amid rubble, struggling to boil whatever could be scavenged. By March 1945, firebombing of Tokyo alone killed more than 100,000 civilians in a single night. Millions were homeless. Even more were starving. Then the unimaginable happened. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. August 9, 1945, Nagasaki. Nuclear devastation, followed by the Emperor's unprecedented radio broadcast on August 15 announcing surrender. But surrender did not magically bring food back. Factories were destroyed. The merchant fleet was gone. Cold weather loomed ahead. People feared mass famine before the year ended. Japan's Ministry of Welfare predicted that up to 10 million people could starve if emergency relief failed. As the occupation approached, anxiety was everywhere. Decades of state propaganda had painted Americans as monsters. Children were told Allied soldiers would kill their families, assault women, destroy everything sacred. Even in surrender, fear ruled the streets. Civilians looked to the sky, wondering, would the conquerors punish them? Would more bombs fall? Would Japan be humiliated and left to die? Many expected the worst. When the first U.S. troops arrived in late August and early September, people watched them with wide, cautious eyes, unsure whether to bow, flee, or fight back tears of exhaustion. Instead of cruelty, something else began to unfold. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, issued directives not for revenge but for relief. The United States recognized that a starving nation could not rebuild, could not stabilize, and certainly could not form a peaceful alliance. So, the same enemy that had once vowed Japan's destruction prepared to save the nation from famine. Japanese civilians did not know what to believe. Rumors ran wild. Would food be withheld as punishment? Would the Allies force Japan to kneel through hunger? No one expected American planes to deliver hope. In the skies above a defeated empire, a new chapter was about to begin. One built not on fire and steel, but on survival and the possibility of forgiveness. Soon, Japanese citizens would witness what they never expected. Compassion dropping from bomb bays. And that change, that sudden shift from terror to astonishment, began with the occupation force's first humanitarian mission, a mission Japan desperately needed. Because winter was coming, and hunger does not wait. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan signed its formal surrender. By then, the American plan for occupation was already moving into motion. General Douglas MacArthur knew Japan stood on the edge of catastrophe. Rail lines were twisted wreckage. Ports were barely functioning. Food production had collapsed to less than 60% of pre-war levels. Even rice, the core of daily life, had become a rarity. Urban families boiled tree bark, grass, and soybean pulp to survive. Black markets thrived in the shadows, trading stolen military stocks at impossible prices. The poorest simply wasted away. The Japanese government privately admitted something horrifying. Without foreign food, mass starvation will be unavoidable. Every civilian feared it. The Allies feared it too. A starving population is unpredictable, desperate, angry, uncontrollable. And Japan had over 7 million soldiers returning home from across Asia and the Pacific. Hungry men with military training were the perfect recipe for disorder. So, MacArthur made a strategic decision. Food would be the first weapon of peace. The U.S. Relief Initiative. Ships from the U.S., Australia, and other allied nations began carrying emergency cargo. Wheat and barley, corn and rice, canned meats, dried beans and milk, vitamins for children, and nutritional supplements for the elderly. Japan's damaged ports strained to keep up. Warehouses became crowded with sacks stamped. Gift of the American people. The logistics were massive. White heavy checkmark millions of tons of food imported. White heavy checkmark distribution networks rebuilt from scratch. White heavy checkmark Japanese police ordered to protect, not seize, supplies. White heavy checkmark schools converted into meal stations. Despite all this, panic persisted. Rumors circulated that the Americans would only feed the cities, leaving rural regions to die. Some feared poisoned food, believing old propaganda that Americans wanted to exterminate the Japanese race. Many civilians refused rations at first. Parents tasted food before allowing children to eat, unsure if safety was real. But hunger breaks suspicion faster than diplomacy. What began as cautious acceptance soon turned into a quiet but powerful realization. The Americans were not here to destroy Japan. They were here to rebuild it. A new relationship under ashes. Every bowl of warm food brought another crack in decades of fear and hostility. Young people in particular began to see the occupation troops as protectors rather than invaders. School children waved as U.S. trucks rumbled past. Nurses worked alongside American medical teams to treat malnourished civilians. And new policies drove change deeper. A land reform gave farmers ownership of their fields. Price controls stabilized food markets. Home gardens encouraged self-sufficiency. U.S. surplus wheat led to a new national staple, bread. By the winter of 1945-46, relief operations intensified. The skies that used to carry destruction now carried salvation. At first through supply airlifts, then something even more symbolic. Care packages dropped directly into the hands of people who once hid below ground from the very same aircraft. This transformation, from terror-stricken survivors to hopeful civilians, was far from smooth. But it was undeniable. Japan was learning that the enemy was changing the rules of war. From firebombing to food drops. From fear to trust. From surrender to survival. And that shift set the stage for remarkable scenes the world never expected to witness. The surrender ended the war, but not the suffering. By late 1945, starvation deaths rose sharply in Japan's major cities. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, spreading disease through crowded shelters and burned-out neighborhoods. Hospitals overflowed with children whose ribs showed through skin. Yet against this backdrop of misery, an unexpected humanitarian bridge formed, and it began with the very people who once represented terror. A mother in Yokohama would cling to her 2 children when American trucks approached, unsure whether to flee. A fisherman in Osaka, his boat destroyed, waited in ration lines from sunrise to dusk. Students in Hiroshima, still haunted by the atomic blast, watched as foreign uniforms entered the city their nation said would never fall. Every interaction carried uncertainty. Most Japanese civilians had never seen a foreigner, especially an American, until now. They expected brutality because they were told to expect brutality. The Japanese government had warned for years. Americans would show no mercy. Allied soldiers were demons. Surrender was worse than death. So trust was not just low, it was unimaginable. But hunger forces a choice. Cling to fear or reach for help. Civilians slowly emerged from hiding. Children approached first, curiosity always stronger than fear. Soldiers offered chocolate, gum, and canned rations. Small gifts opened conversations. And those conversations planted a new truth. The enemy was human and kind. For the U.S., feeding Japan was not simply generosity. It was strategy. Washington understood that peace could die quickly if civilians believed the occupation was worse than the war. Anti-American resistance, similar to what the Allies feared in Germany, could erupt. General MacArthur's leadership reflected this reality. There can be no democracy where the people are starving. To secure stability, the United States would win the peace just as it won the war. Not through dominance, but through decisive action. Food drops and relief shipments served multiple purposes. Heavy checkmark prevent mass unrest and famine. Heavy checkmark build public trust in the occupation government. Heavy checkmark undercut remaining militarist influence. Heavy checkmark demonstrate the strength and benevolence of American power. Propaganda that once painted the U.S. as a merciless enemy now crumbled under the weight of full stomachs. The bombers that once set cities ablaze were now saving them. And every parachute signaled that yesterday's enemy might be tomorrow's ally. Even kindness can be unsettling when it comes from someone you were taught to hate. Many Japanese civilians struggled with shame. Surrender was seen not only as defeat, but as moral failure. Accepting food from the enemy felt like a further humiliation. To address this, American commanders instructed their troops. Be respectful. No boasting. No gloating. No reminders of victory. MacArthur insisted that occupation forces treat civilians with dignity. Bowing instead of shouting, patience instead of force. This discipline preserved what little pride civilians still held. Japanese police, doctors, and government staff were retained to help distribute food, reinforcing the idea that relief came through cooperation, not coercion. Slowly, barriers softened. School children wrote notes of gratitude. Locals brought handmade gifts to American sentries. Neighbors no longer whispered "Oni," demon, when soldiers passed by. Trust, fragile but real, began to grow. The shift was profound. Survival became a shared goal between occupier and occupied. But this was only the beginning. Food shipments on the ground were critical. Yet the most symbolic missions still lay ahead, high in the sky. Because soon, the same aircraft that once delivered destruction would release something that could rebuild a nation and redefine the meaning of victory. The effort to feed Japan was not simply humanitarian. It was a complex logistical campaign that required cooperation from those who were enemies only weeks before. American air power had broken Japan, now it would help rebuild it. The U.S. military deployed aircraft that once carried bombs, reconfigured for relief. B-29 Superfortress, high-capacity transport conversions. C-54 Skymaster, the primary airlift workhorse. C-47 Skytran, used for more remote and smaller drop zones. Pilots plotted flights over cities that had once burned in their crosshairs. Parachute containers replaced incendiaries. Canvas bundles replaced explosive canisters. Each drop required precision. Keycap 1 identify a safe landing area. Keycap 2 mark zones visible from the air. Keycap 3 ensure civilians could gather supplies without chaos. Keycap 4 maintain security against theft or hoarding. Keycap 5 balance flight altitude to avoid accidents or misdrops. Troops trained civilians to organize pickup lines. Teachers, scouts, community leaders standing in places where they once sheltered from firebombs. Children watched with fascination as parachutes drifted down. They no longer fled to shelters, they ran toward life falling from the sky. The symbolism could not be ignored. The same sound of engines overhead that once triggered terror, now triggered hope. Before surrender, the Japanese state had demanded total loyalty and sacrifice. After defeat, the same government struggled to maintain order and protect its civilians. Pride collided with desperation. Prime Minister Shidehara Kajuro and his cabinet faced a painful truth. Japan could no longer feed itself without foreign assistance. Government ministries coordinated directly with SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. Former military supply officers now worked to bring American shipments to schools, temples, community halls, any place with a roof. Police, once used to enforce strict rationing, now protected food convoys from organized crime groups that saw opportunity in chaos. This cooperation, often quiet, sometimes reluctant, reshaped civic responsibilities. The government that once led the nation into war was now managing survival under a foreign commander. But in that tension, something new formed, a political willingness to change. Programs like a land reform, breaking up old estates, price stabilization, ending black market control, the school meal plans ensuring children ate daily. These were revolutionary shifts, and they worked best because the US and Japan executed them together. The most difficult transformation wasn't logistical or political. It was personal. American service members who had lost friends in the Pacific now handed food to the people they once fought. Some struggled with resentment. Memories of Pearl Harbor or kamikaze attacks were still fresh. Japanese civilians felt equally conflicted. How do you accept bread from the same hands that dropped fire on your home? Yet, it was impossible to ignore human vulnerability. A soldier lifting a starving child to safety. A nurse offering soup to an elderly stranger. A pilot waving to crowds gathered where he once targeted. Side by side, former enemies stood in ration lines, rebuilding connections that war had buried under fear and pride. Personal acts spoke louder than political orders. A U.S. medic fixing a broken toy. A Japanese girl gifting a paper crane in gratitude. A Marine teaching English phrases to smiling schoolkids. Small moments, huge shifts. The humanitarian mission was working. But something even more profound was taking shape. Respect. The realization that compassion could achieve what violence never could. And soon, that bond would be tested and strengthened through the most dramatic display of American relief efforts yet. Mass food drops from the sky, witnessed by millions across a nation that had once braced for flames. The turning point of this story was approaching, not in battle but in mercy. The war had ended. Yet in cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Yokohama, families still listen to aircraft engines with fear. Trauma lingers long after peace is declared. But the day came when those engines brought not destruction but deliverance. Operation Santa and other relief airlifts begin. In late 1945 into 1946, the United States launched aerial food supply missions designed to reach regions still isolated by ruined transportation networks. U.S. pilots labeled parts of the effort Operation Santa because the mission, quite literally, involved delivering gifts from the sky. Cargo bays that once carried bombs now held wheat flour, canned fruit and meat, powdered eggs and milk, a sugar and chocolate, a vitamin-enriched biscuits. Packages parachuted down with guidance papers urging civilians to gather calmly and share fairly. Witnesses described their disbelief. We thought the white parachutes were more bombs, until they did not explode. Survivor testimony, Kanagawa Prefecture. Crowds rushed toward the drops, hunger overriding hesitation. Children cheered. Some men wept openly, ashamed yet relieved. A symbolic reversal. Throughout the war, the sight of a B-29 superfortress meant horror. It meant firestorms swallowing neighborhoods. It meant families separated forever. Now, Japanese citizens pointed at airplanes with hope. People who once hid underground stood openly in wide fields, watching food descend like blessings. The psychological shift was immense. The enemy's power no longer brought death, it brought life. This was intentional. American commanders understood the symbolic weight of these missions. Every parachute was a message. We are not here to destroy you anymore. Even former military men who once vowed to fight the U.S. to the death now lined up under foreign aircraft for food to feed their children. Old propaganda shattered in the face of undeniable reality. From fear to celebration, reports describe scenes that would have been unimaginable only months earlier. Civilians waving flags at approaching American aircraft. A local police clearing safe landing zones. Kids racing one another to catch parachutes for souvenirs. Teachers organizing distribution with smiles instead of fear. That transformation did not happen quietly. Newspapers began publishing photos of American soldiers carrying infants or sharing meals with schoolchildren. Symbols of a relationship reborn not from treaties, but from compassion. Many Japanese wrote diary entries filled with gratitude. The planes once brought flames. Now they bring tomorrow. Osaka schoolteacher, winter 1946. The change spread across public consciousness like a slow sunrise. The shadows of war still lingered, but hope was no longer hidden. A tactical victory wrapped in humanity. The food drops instantly stabilized many urban areas. Crime declined, fewer people were desperate. Riots over rationing diminished. Public trust in the occupation surged. Feeding a nation became the first major success of American post-war policy. By mid-1946, malnutrition deaths had significantly decreased in several major population centers. A turning point that prevented a second national tragedy after surrender. But even as food deliveries expanded, the emotional impact grew stronger than any statistic could measure. Parents taught children a new lesson. The Americans were once feared, but now they were to be welcomed. The skies had become friendly. That shift from terror to trust changed history, because when a former enemy saves your life, the meaning of war itself is transformed. The most powerful chapter of this story was now unfolding, when gratitude replaced fear and compassion replaced hatred. Former enemies were becoming partners and soon allies. The skies over Japan would never be seen the same way again. The food drops were more than a relief mission, they were a turning point in world history. Japan had vowed never to surrender. America had vowed to defeat Japan at any cost. Yet only months after the most brutal conflict in the Pacific, something unprecedented began to form. A friendship born from mercy, changing minds, saving lives. In the first months of 1946, the occupation saw a dramatic change in public sentiment. Posters praising the United States appeared outside schools. Shrines held prayers not for victory, but for gratitude. Parents told children, "The Americans helped keep you alive." For the Japanese people, this was not a political shift. It was personal. When a mother receives food that keeps her child alive, loyalty changes. When a starving boy tastes chocolate from a foreign soldier, hatred breaks. Trust grew in everyday moments. The GIs helping rebuild playgrounds. Doctors collaborating to treat the sick. Pilots greeted with cheers rather than fear. A local women trading recipes with American relief workers. The occupation troops were no longer faceless conquerors. They were neighbors. From a broken empire to a reborn nation. General MacArthur pushed not only relief but reform. Japan needed white heavy checkmark reliable food distribution. White heavy checkmark agricultural modernization. White heavy checkmark democratization of government. White heavy checkmark a population strong enough to rebuild. American and Japanese officials worked side by side to stabilize the nation. Malnutrition decreased. Schools became meeting places for shared meals and lessons. Social programs expanded, improving public health faster than many expected. By autumn 1946, diaries and newspapers told a new story. Yesterday's enemy feeds us today. We will not forget. Housewife, Tokyo. Food was no longer merely sustenance. It was proof of a new future. American leaders recognized this impact. Compassion had achieved what bombs never could. A transformation of hearts. Japan was shifting from a defeated adversary to a necessary partner in a changing global landscape. The Cold War dawned quickly, and the U.S. needed allies in Asia. Feeding Japan wasn't just humane. It was strategic foresight. Washington saw potential where others saw ashes. A strong, democratic Japan could balance Soviet expansion. A grateful Japan could support American presence in the Pacific. A revived Japan would contribute to global trade and security. This was more than rebuilding, it was reimagining. Civilians who once bowed with fear now bowed with respect. American soldiers returned those bows, a symmetry unimaginable during wartime. And gradually, a remarkable idea took hold: friendship. Some relief pilots returned home with drawings and origami gifts from Japanese children. Local students learned English. American troops learned Japanese customs. Each interaction dissolved the image of the other. The relationship between Japan and the U.S. was becoming not transactional, but emotional. Former pilots spoke of watching crowds gather under their aircraft. The cheers, the smiles, we never saw that during the war. B-29 crewmen, 1946. The same technology that once delivered terror now delivered trust. In a world exhausted by war, Japan became a symbol of something rare. A defeated nation rescued by its conqueror. That act of mercy forged a bond stronger than treaties. Food drops created more than just nourishment, they created belief. Belief that enemies could become partners. Belief that survival was a shared destiny. Belief that Japan could rise again. And from that belief, a new Japan emerged. One that would soon transform into an economic power and one of America's closest allies. What happened next was not just recovery, but rebirth. The war had ended. The hatred had faded. And in the sky where bombs once fell, hope descended instead. Now the consequences of that transformation would reshape the world. By 1946, the United States and Japan were no longer locked in the grip of hatred. They were bound by survival. But survival was just the beginning. The American occupation now turned toward something far greater than relief. The reconstruction of a nation that had lost nearly everything. Stabilizing the nation, food as the foundation of peace. Every ton of food shipped to Japan after surrender became a cornerstone of national recovery. Between 1946 and 1949, the United States delivered over 5 million tons of wheat, barley, rice, and corn through relief programs, including shipments from the U.S. Army, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, and later the ECA, Economic Cooperation Administration, under the Marshall Plan framework. At the center of this effort was General MacArthur's conviction that Japan's stability rested not in weapons or ideology, but in full stomachs. Nutrition surveys showed drastic improvements. In cities like Tokyo, average caloric intake rose from under 1,000 calories a day in 1945 to nearly 2,000 by 1948. Children who had once been skeletal could now attend school again. Rations included wheat bread, dried milk, and cornmeal, ingredients alien to Japanese cuisine. But necessity changed habits. Bread, once a symbol of the West, became an emblem of survival. Policy from the ground up. While food saved lives, policy ensured those lives could rebuild. The Land Reform Act of 1946 redistributed millions of acres from absentee landlords to tenant farmers, empowering rural families to feed themselves and ending centuries of feudal dependence. MacArthur's administration also encouraged the growth of small cooperatives, ensuring that farmers could collectively manage resources and stabilize prices. For the first time, Japanese agriculture operated under democratic, community-led principles. In cities, public kitchens, many funded by American relief groups, provided school lunches and affordable meals. The Kyushoku program, or School Lunch Initiative, became a cornerstone of Japan's post-war childhood. Millions of children received their first regular, nutritious meals through these efforts, often featuring wheat rolls, powdered milk, and vegetables provided by the U.S. What began as emergency aid evolved into a national institution that continues even decades later. Changing attitudes and social recovery. Food not only rebuilt bodies, it mended the national psyche. Where starvation once fueled hopelessness, nourishment inspired determination. People returned to work. Factories reopened. Trains began to run again. Newspapers from 1947 carried headlines like, "American grain arrives, hope restored." Children laugh again in Tokyo schools. For many civilians, the change was deeply emotional. They remembered nights when skies burned red and hunger seemed endless. and now saw Americans unloading ships with the same precision once used to wage war. That contradiction created awe and gratitude. U.S. troops, initially stationed as conquerors, became known as white angels among some Japanese communities. Church groups, civic organizations, and individuals across America donated money and supplies, sending clothing and food through programs like licensed agencies for relief in Asia Lara, a partnership between private American charities and Japanese local groups. Through it all, the message was clear. You are no longer our enemy. You are our responsibility. Economic sparks. The relief programs didn't just prevent famine. They kick-started economic recovery. Farmers who received American wheat seeds began experimenting with hybrid crops suited to Japan's soil. Canneries reopened to process imported goods. Domestic shipping and rail lines were rebuilt to move food inland, the same logistics networks that would later support Japan's industrial boom. Food security became economic stability, and economic stability paved the road to democracy. By late 1948, Japan's economy was showing signs of renewal. Industrial output nearly doubled compared to 1946. Markets returned. Confidence, once unthinkable, began to grow. But Japan's rebirth was far from complete. The question remained, could this alliance endure once the hunger was gone? The answer would unfold in the years that followed, as compassion transformed into cooperation, and relief evolved into partnership. By the late 1940s, the United States' massive food relief shipments were no longer simply crates of grain and supplies, they became the foundation of diplomacy. Where most empires ruled through force and taxes, America was using bread as its currency of influence. A new world order forms. The world had changed. The Soviet Union was expanding influence across China, Korea, and Eastern Europe. American strategists realized that Japan, once a defeated enemy, might become their most crucial partner in Asia. But for partnership to exist, trust had to be rebuilt. That trust was already forming in school lunchrooms, farmland, and docks across the country. When Japanese children raised their hands in gratitude before eating wheat rolls and milk imported from the U.S., the seeds of a new alliance were planted deeper than any treaty could reach. MacArthur saw Japan not as a conquered enemy, but as a future bulwark of democracy. The Marshall Plan effect, Japan's own economic miracle, begins. Though Japan was not part of the European Marshall Plan, its post-war recovery followed a similar philosophy. Feed the people, rebuild industry, support free markets, strengthen democracy. The U.S. implemented the Dodge Line reforms in 1949, strict financial controls designed to end hyperinflation and stabilize the yen. It was painful at first. Wages froze, industry struggled, but within 2 years, Japanese currency became one of the most stable in Asia. Factories that once built destroyers and Zero fighters shifted to automobiles, cameras, electronics, kitchen appliances, steel and shipbuilding. American wheat and flour spurred an unexpected industry. Bakeries. Thousands opened nationwide, producing bread, pastries, noodles. Affordable food for a recovering urban population. By 1952, Japanese GDP surged upward. The engines of what would later be known as the economic miracle had roared to life. Soft power through hunger relief. Japan was not the only nation receiving American food. U.S. grain fed more than 100 million people worldwide after World War II. But in Japan, the cultural impact went beyond survival. Civilians started referring to wheat bread as America Pan, the bread of America. Textbooks praised the generosity of the Allied relief. Newspapers chronicled how American families donated clothing and toys. This was soft power at its most powerful form. Not forced, not demanded, earned. A simple bowl of hot soup could change hearts faster than politics ever could. Uniting former enemies. Interactions between American soldiers and Japanese civilians evolved from hesitation to genuine kindness. A GI might hand a candy bar to a shy child. A nurse might bandage the hands of a grandmother who survived bombings. A chaplain might help rebuild a burned school. These small gestures created an enormous shift. By the time the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed in 1951, Officially ending the state of war, public suspicion had largely dissolved. Many Japanese citizens saw the United States not as conquerors, but as protectors. The two nations signed a security treaty the same year, ensuring U.S. forces would remain in Japan as guardians of stability in the Pacific. Thus began a strategic partnership that continues to shape global politics today. A nation redefined. Japan emerged from the ashes with white heavy checkmark, a democratic constitution. White heavy checkmark, land ownership for its farmers. White heavy checkmark, a modern industrial economy. White heavy checkmark, international friendship, once unimaginable. And at the core of this transformation, the one thing that first reopened the door was food. Not bombs. Not intimidation. Not humiliation. Food. It is one of history's greatest ironies. The same country that had once firebombed Tokyo would become the provider that saved it from starvation. Japan's rebirth was now unstoppable. And soon, the world would witness the rise of a peaceful superpower, built on gratitude, industry, and partnership. The war had ended in fire and darkness. Japan's cities lay in ruins, and its people were exhausted by years of sacrifice and fear. Hunger had no ideology. It punished civilians long after armies surrendered. But then the skies changed. Where once the B-29s brought destruction, they returned with bread, rice, milk, chocolate, and hope. For the first time in years, Japanese civilians looked upward without terror. Those parachutes did more than deliver calories. They delivered a message. You will not face the future alone. History often remembers wars by their battles, generals, and strategies. But peace is built in quieter ways, through full stomachs, rebuilt communities, and the rediscovery of dignity. Children saved from hunger grew up to lead Japan's economic revival. Schools reopened. Factories hummed. Life returned. Former enemies became allies, not because of treaties signed in grand halls, but because of countless small gestures shared on ruined streets. A warm meal, a helping hand, a moment of shared humanity. Today, Japan stands as one of the most prosperous and peaceful nations on earth. Its partnership with the United States remains one of the strongest in the world. This story reminds us that even after the darkest chapters, compassion can reshape nations. Mercy can become strategy. And sometimes, the greatest victory is not won by force, but by feeding the hungry. The skies that once carried fear had carried hope instead. And a new world began.